Hey there, my name is Luis Miranda, 3D artist from Denver, Colorado. Today we're going to be looking at how to take your Cinema 4D renders from 80 to 100% using my personal workflow on compositing 3D elements using After Effects. We're going to focus on the why rather than the how, although there's going to be a lot of tips and tricks thrown in there as well. Hopefully, with these concepts in mind, you'll be able to take your renders from this to this. I'm inside of Cinema 4D to show you the AOVs I like to work with. If you're unaware of what an AOV is, I like to think of the image that comes out of Cinema 4D as layers, and they produce the beauty, as we can see right here. But the beauty is comprised of dozens of individual layers that ultimately create the final image. This includes base color data, reflectivity, shininess, and all sorts of other things. In fact, if you were to export all of the AOVs, you could actually rebuild the beauty paths in a compositor like After Effects by stacking layers in their correct order with the correct transfer modes. But in this case, we're only going to grab the AOVs that help us achieve the look that we're going for. Think of it as the minimum viable product. Get exactly what you need to achieve the image. If you want to give these tips a try, check the link in the description so that you can get the same render files that I'm going to be working with. Alright, let's get started. There is no right or wrong answer on which AOVs to use. This is just my personal preference, so if you have any AOVs you like to work with, feel free to add them to the list. So I'll briefly talk about why I like these particular AOVs. For diffuse filter, I like it because it gives me pure color information. This allows me to color pick the exact color of my elements, which allows me to colorize any additional elements that I add to the scene. Diffuse lighting is one that I rarely use, but I like to keep around because in combination with the diffuse, reflection, specular lighting, and GI, it allows me to recreate a close approximation of the beauty paths. This is usually to fix little mistakes that I missed in render. Reflection and specular lighting are similar in that you can make the shine and reflectivity of objects really pop with simple curves adjustments. GI is nice for boosting the bounce light of the scene. Can't really see much, but if you were to look closely or boost the brightness of the image, you would see that there's some light coming in between the buildings. And Emission is really great for glow effects. And finally, for the more utility AOVs, I like to use two Cryptomattes, one set to object and one set to materials. This will give me the ability to create a matte for any and all objects in my scene, either by isolating the material that they're using or by isolating them as an object. And with the depth paths, this is great for adding depth of field, but also works for creating haze and atmospheric effects. So with that out the way, let's go ahead and hop over to After Effects so we can start compositing. Alright, now we're in After Effects. Let's go ahead and import all of our files. I like to keep things organized in this file structure. It's what works for me and for the studios I worked at, but of course feel free to organize it however you want. Let's grab our beauty paths and create a new comp. It should set everything for us automatically. I'm also going to be working at 32 bits. So right away, I like to set a black background as a solid. The beauty path has an alpha channel, which will be nice for adding additional background elements, but also there will be some AOVs like Cryptomattes and depth that can cause some wackiness in our composite if they are visible. The way I like to create my stack is the beauty and background act as a line to separate the utility AOVs from the AOVs that go above the beauty and make modifications to the aesthetic of the image. I like to color these layers to create a distinction between the beauty and the utility. So above the line, I like to bring in reflection, specular lighting, GI, and emission. So let's go ahead and drop these on. And technically, you're supposed to put these on screen, but I like to use lighten instead. It doesn't add quite as much brightness as screen does, because if you compare it to the original image, it makes it pretty bright. However, with lighten, it's not quite as bright. It just makes certain parts pop out a little bit more, which is kind of what I'm going for. The only drawback is that you can't darken it below the existing brightness. For as long as I've been doing this, this has worked out pretty great for me. I also like to keep emission at the top and also keep this one at normal, but I will keep this one off for right now. When they are all set, you'll see that the image is pretty unchanged. It's slightly brighter and it has a little bit more detail in certain areas. But if you want to see it change, you can add a curves adjustment to your layers and then boost them, and you'll see that it makes that particular property a lot more visible. So in this case, I'm messing around with the reflections, and everything that's being reflected is now getting brighter. So let's go ahead and add these to the other layers. And so now I'll be able to make adjustments to each one individually. But for emission, I like to put in a glow effect. I'm going to be using plugins from Maxon One, so if you have a subscription, you'll be able to use the same effects as I am. But if you don't, there's always built-in alternatives you can use. I'll be sure to call them out. My favorite glow effect is optical glow, so I'll add it to the emission. By default, it glows on the black background. So what I like to do is to tell it to unmultiply the background, and it creates an alpha channel. If you want to do this with the built-in glow, what you can do first is add an unmultiply effect, put it before the glow, and then activate the glow. And now you'll see that it's actually generating an alpha channel. Cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and deactivate those and turn on my optical glow. I intentionally left all of the emission sources on the image so we can give ourselves a challenge on how to separate them. Right now, the emission is glowing across the entire image, but we want to separate the glow from the car, from the pyramids, and from the smaller buildings. This is where we can use Cryptomattes in conjunction with the other AOVs. So let's go ahead and bring in our Cryptomattes. I'm going to colorize these to designate them as utilities. When you bring them in, they're black, but in order to use them, you want to use a plugin called Cryptomatte. In order to use them, you can use a free plugin from OpenEXR. They actually make several plugins that are designed to work specifically for the EXR format. And as such, our Cryptomattes have to be in the EXR format. I'm going to apply the Cryptomatte effect to the layer that is set to object mode. And here, once you click in on the object, you can start clicking inside of the canvas and you'll see things start to light up. And if you want to add to the selection, you can hold down Shift and you'll see that there's a little plus button. And so then you can start adding more to your selection. So as a demonstration, here in output, if you go down here to matte only, it'll create a black and white mask that is only those objects that you created. You can also do a matted RGBA, which will be black, but it will create an alpha channel. So whichever one you like to work with the most, I would just recommend going with that. Just make sure that all your track mats and all that stuff is set to alpha, but I'm going to be using matte only, which will require me to use luminance. And also, if you want to remove objects, you can hit Control and it'll actually create like these scissors and you can start clicking in and start removing from the selection. So I'm going to hit reset, and all I really want to isolate in this particular layer is the headlights. So I'm just going to click on those, and that's all we have to do. So I'm just going to go to matte only, and it creates that matte. Cool. So in our emission, I want to isolate this to just the headlights. And sure, I could, use a pen tool, but if this was an animation, you can't really do that, for the entire duration of the animation. You need something that works in a more like procedural way that gives you more control. So we're going to use this matte, our object, as a track matte. However, the normal way of doing track mattes, such as using this button right here, creates an issue. So if I set this to luminance and I isolate it, you'll notice that nothing really changed, but what's actually happening is that it is glowing. However, this track matte is actually cutting it off. So what you want to do is create the track matte first and then apply the glow. The way to do that is by using an effect called set matte. So once you have set matte put on here, what you want to do is select your crypto that's set to object and then set it over here to luminance because I am using a black and white mask. However, nothing's happening because you want to set this thing right here from source. You want to put to effects and masks. And so now you can kind of see it. Let's go ahead and isolate it. And let's go ahead and get rid of the background. And you can see it here. And if you set the optical glow after the set matte, you'll notice that it is now glowing and it's only that one and nothing else is being affected. And so Here you now have the ability to control the brightness, the size, you can even colorize it, all that good stuff, but we're not going to focus too much on that. So now we want to create more of these mats for the other objects that we want to have glowing, such as the pyramids and also these buildings down here. So let's go ahead and do that. But before we do, let's go ahead and actually name some of these things. So this guy, we're just going to call Crypto, and then we're going to call it Headlights. Cool. Let's go ahead and create a duplicate. And this one we're going to call Pyramids. Let's hit reset. And now let's go ahead and select the lights on the pyramids. So if you just hold down Shift as you select, if you accidentally picked something, just go ahead and hit Control and unclick it. Cool. So now the lights here are isolated. Let's go ahead and do matte only. And on our emission, let's go ahead and create a duplicate. Actually, before we do that, let's go ahead and rename it. Duplicate it. Let's call it Pyramids. And here we can just set it to pyramids. And now they are glowing as well. You can adjust this however you want, but let's not get too carried away just yet, because now we need to do them for everything else. All right, so now what we want to do is separate the buildings and their illumination from the pyramid and these headlights. And here's where we get to use the other Cryptomatte. So when you're using your material one, let's go ahead and isolate it. We can see that the materials that are being shared across buildings makes it a little easier to separate the buildings from these two. But we only really need to isolate the things that are glowing. So you can either select all of the buildings, or you can just go in and select all of these individual colors. So let's go ahead and just do that. So you can see that this one is colored. You can see it how it selects the other ones. And we don't necessarily need to select every single one, but once we set that to matte only, you can see that these are now glowing. It now will isolate it. And now you can activate your glow. And once you set your glow, you can see that they now are glowing on their own. So let's go ahead and increase just a little bit. Just increase the size a little bit and just bring it down just a tiny bit. So you don't necessarily need to stick all of these different glows and just make the image super bright. So with that being said, let's go ahead and make sure that the headlights are the brightest thing. So let's go ahead and isolate, and let's go ahead and make it bigger. Maybe bring down. Also, the thing that's really cool about this optical glow is that if you use this radiate, it actually can create like headlights, which I think are pretty cool. So I'm just going to do that just a tiny bit. You can also adjust the direction in which they point. So I'm just going to bring it around here. Okay, cool. So now those things are glowing. You can also colorize it by sticking like a little bit of color into it. Purple looks nice. Cool. So now let's go ahead and put this one on top. And the pyramids, we can just increase the size, but not necessarily the brightness, just to kind of give it like a nice like cyberpunk look to it. Let's do 5. Cool. And the buildings, I like where they are. They're not too intrusive, so I think I'm good with that. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and bring more attention to the car. One of the easier ways to do this is to basically just make everything darker. So let's create ourselves an adjustment layer. I'm going to call it BG Darken. And with this one, I'm just going to grab an exposure. And I'm going to bring it all the way, bring it pretty low. And something that you can do, which I find really fun, is that if you duplicate one of these cryptos, let's reset it. And let's go ahead and just select the car. And if you ever select anything behind the object, all you have to do is just click it with the control, and you'll see that it's creating the mask. Cool, let's go ahead and set it to matte only. And let's go ahead and change this to car solo. Cool. And now on this guy, what we can do is using our track matte, we can set it to car solo, set it to luminance, and then invert it. And you'll see that it's darkening everything except the car. And so here you have a lot of control over. It pops out a lot, you know, but it kind of also feels a little unnatural because it's also kind of messing with the glow and all these other stuff. So it might be a good idea to put it underneath all of the emission layers so that there's a little bit more contrast between the brightness of the buildings and also these glows. And if the glow on the pyramid is maybe being a little too much, you can always tone it down and you still have complete control over it. And this also works for the other AOVs. So something like reflection, when we crank it up, you'll see that it affects the entire image. But if we also set it to our car solo, if you set this to luminance, you'll see that it's only affecting this one. On this one, we don't have to invert it because it will then adjust everything behind it, but I want to focus on the car itself. So when I move around, you can see that it can make it a lot brighter on the vehicle itself. Cool. And I'm gonna do this for the other ones as well, like specular lighting. So let's go ahead and do car solo and set it to luminance. And we can play with this guy as well. Something I like to do is to play with these RGB values. I'm gonna bring up the blue so that it can exaggerate the purple a little bit more. You know, if you do it too much, it'll completely change the color of the car, but if you bring up blue and a little bit of red, it'll kind of create a nice little purple tint. So, you know, I kind of want to still keep some of the blue in there, but not overdo it. Cool. So with GI, on the other hand, I kind of want to use this on the background. So you can kind of see how it like brings up the buildings. And since there isn't really too much GI on the car, except for this little area, I'm okay with doing this globally. So let's go ahead and just pop it a little bit and maybe create like a little S-curve. Cool. And here I want to remove some of this red so that it looks a little bit more bluish. And I'm going to get rid of some of this green as well. I'm going to go over here to blue and crank this guy up a little bit to give it a little bit more of a purple look to it. And at any point you can use this darken to, you know, if you want to bring a little bit more brightness to the environment, you can. I'm going to keep it just pretty low, something like around here. And something I would also recommend doing is for something like GI, you can see that it makes a big difference whether it's underneath the darken layer or not. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this over so that it has, so it's not, you know, being affected by the exposure. So we're kind of in a good spot. Let's go ahead and add a few more details to really get it to the finish line. Let's go ahead and bring in our depth matte. And here we can see our depth matte working. You know, anything that is white means that it's completely far away. Anything that is dark or black, it means that it's closer to the camera. So we can go ahead and create a new adjustment layer. We're going to call this one DOF for depth of field. And let's go ahead and put in camera length blur. I'm going to put something big like 20 just to really exaggerate it. And here in our blur, we can select our depth layer. And you can see that it brings attention to the car. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit, just back to 5, and slowly bring it up, just to give it a little bit of background. I don't necessarily want it to be completely out of focus. The issue with adding too much depth of field is that it'll make the buildings look kind of like miniatures, and you don't want to do that, especially if we're trying to like give the impression of scale here. Let's go ahead and duplicate our depth of field layer. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this one and signify it as being for depth of field. And so I'm going to make a copy, and this one is going to be for haze. Okay, with this one selected, we're going to use levels. And when you move this around, you can see that it's you're controlling where the start and stop is. So here it's isolating the car, but if you move these around, you can have the start or like the closest thing be, start here. This is really nice for like hiding stuff in between buildings. So if you create enough of a sliver, it'll only appear behind certain buildings. So like right here, you can basically give the entire scene a little bit of haze except for like the front part. And so if we drop this over and do something like screen, and then control the opacity, you can give it this nice little like sense of haze in the environment. And here you can then use a tint to colorize it. So if you were to go in here and add a little bit of purple, and let's bring down the saturation so it's not too overwhelming. But if you notice, it's kind of doing all these weird things to here. So another thing you can try doing is using the unmult effect again, and put it behind the tint. And so now it'll basically get rid of all of the black and just leave the haze. And you now still have the ability to adjust how far it goes. Cool. This is also really nice if you want to bring in like smoke elements. So if you have a lot of like stock material, this is like the place to bring it in. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in some of my own, and I'll show you how to use it in conjunction with the depth. I went ahead and imported some stock of some dust, and let's go ahead and incorporate this into the scene. Cool. So let's go ahead and grab our first one. Let's solo it and find a good frame for it. Something like this looks nice. I'm also going to want to put a mask on it, and let's go ahead and hit F so we can feather it. We don't really want to see those edges on the sides, so let's just kind of bring it in a little bit. I think it's okay to have it on the bottom since it's going to be kind of hidden. So let's also go ahead and set this as, let's use our depth haze, and you can see it hiding in those buildings. So I can tell you right away that you're not going to be able to see it once you unsolo it. So like it's hard to see it there. Like it's there, but it's not quite that visible. So something I would recommend doing is adding a curves, and here go down to alpha, and then you can boost it up and you can see it like really start to pop out. Cool. Another thing I would do is use a tint. And something I like to do is to colorize it near the colors that are visible. So in this particular case, I want to make it look like this green. So I'm going to go ahead and select these pyramids and just solo them. And here in the tint, on map white 2, let's go ahead and select our green. And you can see it now having been tinted green. So when we unsolo it, you can now see it in there. You can adjust it, and as you move it, you'll see that it kind of fades in and out between the buildings. So let's go ahead and solo it one more time. And let's crank this alpha just a little bit more. And here's where our transfer modes can really help out. If you hit an add, and let's bring it down and put it right above the darken layer. And if you really want to exaggerate it, you can duplicate it on top, and it becomes very obvious that there's a smoke layer there. So let's go ahead and undo that, and let's also mess around with this depth haze. I'm going to get rid of the tint as well because I was just showing it as an example, and I'm also going to get rid of this unmult. So now when we isolate our dust wave, and let's turn off our depth haze. So let's set it to Luma, And while you have the depth phase selected, but only the dust wave soloed, here you can then adjust the levels and you can see it working in real time. So something else I want to do is maybe shrink this guy a little bit because it kind of does feel a little unrealistically huge. So let's go ahead and do that. Click back on the depth phase, and here you can really adjust where it's affecting. So maybe if you want it closer to the pyramids, you can really isolate it. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and remove that. We can now see it working back there. So if we make one more, actually a few more copies, but let's go ahead and just move it over somewhere over here. And this one we can tint red. I'm just gonna go ahead and click in there. And so you can see how it looks like it's catching the glow from the red. And let's do one more copy and bring it over. Bring it up a little higher. And let's go ahead and tint it like this blue. Cool. This one's a little harder to see, so I'm gonna lighten this color a little bit. I'm also gonna move this around so that they're not set on the same time. And something else that's really nice about this dust wave is that you can then make a separate copy that isn't being influenced by the depth pass. And all you have to do is set it behind the beauty, but above the background. And so here you can then bring it up and use these as like clouds. And this one we can also tone down the alpha ramp. And so it's a little bit softer and kind of has like that more natural look to it. And of course you can use any of your other stock elements and see which one looks better. Kind of like how this is looking. So let's go ahead and put that there. And let's create one more layer and put it on this side, just to kind of give it a little bit of balance to the scene. Make it a little bit bigger. Cool. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and do a couple of small adjustments to really elevate the image. I'm gonna duplicate our background. I'm gonna go ahead and add a ramp. And so you can see how it's bright. What I want to do is bring this to more of a blue. And this way I can give it a little bit of like a haze. Almost like it's like dawn or dusk. So nice little blue. You can also adjust this to bring it up or down, depending on how you want it. And if you want to take it a step even further, you can duplicate your background one more time, get rid of this gradient ramp, and use a fractal noise. Let's isolate this real quick. And here inside of the contrast and brightness, we can increase this and lower the brightness and increase more of the contrast. And in the transform, if you want to play around with the scaling, you can make it smaller. And here it kind of looks like a star field. If you set this to screen, cool. So yeah. And so here you can give it some stars. Of course, you can play around with it some more. So if you want to make them more dense, you can just scale it down a little bit. And you know, you also have control over how bright it is. Cool. So let's get into the smaller details that really help elevate the final image. So far, we've basically been using curves and levels as a way to establish hierarchy or to modify properties, but we haven't done any color grading to give it a look. So let's go ahead and do that. For color grading, I really like to use looks from Red Giant, which is included in Maxon 1. Again, if you don't have it, there's Lumetri built into After Effects, which can do similar color grading. At this point, it becomes a matter of taste. The way I like to grade is purely my own preference. So with that in mind, I'll try my best to explain my thought process, but if I'm being honest with you, a lot of my decisions are purely because I think they look cool. So while Lux has a lot of presets, I'm going to start from scratch and add the effects I tend to use a lot. Alright. I like chromatic aberration and grain because I like to recreate the griminess of physical lenses, and that's always the ultimate irony of working in 3D. Most of your time is to make things look less perfect. Cool. I also like to add this haze effect, and it creates a nice diffuse look on the bright areas of the image. There's also this reflection, which helps give it a lens flare look. Let's go ahead and tint it closer to purple. I also like to use this diffusion. This one kind of creates a secondary glow, which can help soften the image a bit. There's a ton of other effects that you can apply, but if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this, it's the fact that I use very small numbers in my settings. There's a certain beauty in restraint. Eventually, all those small touches add up to a sum that is greater than its parts. It also communicates a level of taste as an artist. So last thing, I'm going to add a lens flare to the headlights using optical flares. I'm also going to create a vignette to further draw attention to the car. And finally, I'm going to add one small S-curve on top of everything. Just to give everything a little bit of contrast. And that's it. Let's do a before and after just so we can see how far we've taken this image. So before and after. It's almost like going from the graphics of the PS1 to the PS5. And I think that illustrates the power of compositing. So hopefully this helps you see your renders differently. You don't always have to get it 100% in render. There are so many things that you can do in post that take significantly less time and oftentimes provide a bigger boost to the end product. So if you're interested in learning more techniques like this, I highly recommend checking out School of Motion's Lights Camera Render. If you like the model of the flying car and the background buildings that I used, you actually get that as part of a kit bash set that's included with the course. It includes all sorts of stuff, including those things and other things that I didn't even use. Feel free to download the project files so that you can get access to the same render files that I was working with, and so that you can apply these compositing techniques. Tag School of Motion on your socials so that we can see what you make. I've been Luis Miranda. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.